Good evening to all respectable doctors. On behalf of Sun Pharma Senora Division, I am welcome to you all for this scientific session. And actually, this COVID time, it is a required. And even what happened is, even this COVID time, how is the vaccination? It is a safer to the pregnancy or not? All the discussion we are included here. And I thank you very much for BSOG platform. They given this opportunity to present ourselves and this scientific session also. And thank you very much all doctor who is attending here in this busy schedule. And moreover, this time is a very precious. All doctor, even responsibility is very high. In this time also you are presented here for this scientific session. I am grateful to you all, the respectable doctor. Thank you very much. And welcome once again from behalf of Sun Pharma Senora Division. Madam, I am handovering this session to Manjula Madam. Madam, please.
Thank you so much, Manikantan. Thanks for this opportunity for making us come together in this pandemic. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any other ways to meet each other. So yes, without much delay, let us start today's CME on women's wellness and illness, speak the unspoken. This is the theme of the year BSOG 2021 and 22. I welcome one and all today's chairpersons, Dr. Uma Devi, Dr. Mahesh Koregol, and today's speaker, Dr. Padmini Prasad and Dr. Shantala Kumari, and all the BSOG members, senior members, and all the EC members, each and everyone for this academic feast. So without much delay, let me introduce today's chairperson, Dr. Uma Devi. She is a current treasurer of our society 2021 and 22. She's a senior consultant and she was a former head of the department at MS Ramaiah Medical College. She's got the vast experience of UG and PG teaching, and she's a WHO fellow in gynec oncology, that is ovarian cancer and colposcopy. And she has got various fellowship training in urogynecology, infertility, and laparoscopic gynec oncosurgery, obstetrics and ultrasound, general ultrasound, and advanced obstetric Doppler and fetal echo. And she has got various publications in textbooks. And she has been South Asian Advisory Panel, Dealing Day Operative Gynecologist, Bureau of Gynec Endocrinology, BEREC and Nova Gynecology textbooks. She's a trainer for government doctors under India Population Project 1997 to 1999 at MSRMC. I welcome you, ma'am, to chair this session. Now I welcome Dr. Mahesh Koregol, another chairperson for this webinar. And again, Mahesh needs no introduction at all. He's a current secretary of BSOG 2021-22, and he is a senior fertility specialist consultant in Nova IVF Fertility, Bangalore. And he's now chairperson Reproductive Endocrinology Committee 2021-22 KSOG. Is a member of Foxy Endoscopy Committee 2018-21. Is member of various academic bodies like Foxy, ISAR, KISAR, IFS, ICOG, and IEG, IAC. He has got a teacher fellowship program in reproductive medicine and Nova IVF fertility, and he has got teaching experience as assistant professor in JNMC Belgavi and Ambedkar Medical College, Bangalore. And he is a reviewer of journal Infertility and Fertility Medicine, and he has published 5 research papers in international index scientific journals as a first author, and is co-author for several textbooks of infertility. So I hand over the floor to the chairpersons to start the session with the speakers, Dr. Padmini Prasad and Shantala Kumari.
Thank you, Dr. Manjula, for that wonderful introduction. And today's important session we have, why is it important session today, is the fact that the question, the battle or the debates of vaccinating the the pregnant woman, the lactating woman, and the complications that may arise that could be vaccine-related complication or even the geopolitical repercussions. So many other things were involved, and our pregnant and women, lactating women, were felt left out of this vaccination drive during this pandemic, which is one of the devastating pandemic we have seen in recent times. So it is very important that we are going to speak on this topic, was to clarify what is the stand taken by the world, what is the stand taken by India, what might happen, what is already happening, and other things, and so many scientific things and non-scientific things. All these questions need to be put an end. So hereby I welcome the speaker for this important topic, Dr. Shantala, who is one of the EC members of Bangalore Society of OBG, who has completed her undergraduate from BMC, and Lady our MD from Lady Hardinge Medical College, Delhi, and she was recipient of the Jeevan Lata Memorial Award for the best outgoing PG in Delhi University. She had over 25 years of experience as OBGYN in India and abroad. She has served in charitable and private and government sectors in India and worked for Excel Healthcare, LLC, Dubai, UAE. Her areas of interest include high-risk pregnancy, adolescent health, menopausal care, and community services for improving women's health. She has written various chapters for medical textbooks. She published bilingual writer, Kannada and English of fiction, non-fiction, newspaper, columns, artists of various magazines, and she's a very good painter above all this, which is not mentioned here. So I think she's one of the best persons and senior persons, and who's really involved in grassroots level of working with people for healthcare needs also. So I think she's the best person to speak on this topic today and enlighten us and ask about what is the vaccination status. Dr. Shantala, please welcome.
Painter la artist.
Shanti.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Mahesh, for that introduction. Let me start the screen sharing. Yes, at the outset, let me thank the BSOG and our president, Dr. Padmini Prasad, and the BSOG members for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on vaccination and masking in pregnancy. Thank you also, Mr. Manikantan and Sun Pharma, for giving me this opportunity. As of today, this morning, 22nd, I would like to share the statistics. India has the dubious distinction of being the second country with the largest number of cases at 2.62 crores. And the new cases yesterday were 2.54 lakhs with over 4,100 deaths. At this rate, we are sure to cross USA in the next 20 days if we go at this rate of new cases. So it is at this juncture that we are trying to flatten the curve and even take the curve downwards. As you can see on this side, the number of new cases has reduced. It was over 4,14,000, but it has reduced. But to keep it at that, we need to take the preventive measures. Now, what are we actually fighting against? We are fighting against the COVID, that is the coronavirus-induced disease. We are fighting against COVID-related conditions, be it mental, social, and financial. We are fighting against shortages. It was PPE kits and ventilators during the first wave, and now it is about oxygen, medicine, and Now it's about oxygen, medicine, and ICU beds. We are fighting disinformation. I have purposefully put the word disinformation instead of misinformation because disinformation is dangerous. All of us receive hundreds of unverified forwards on WhatsApp, one-sided stories on social media, and unscientific materials and methods for treatment of COVID, and finally, unnecessary political arguments, which we don't need in this time of a raging pandemic. We are also fighting vaccine nationalism, vaccine hesitancy, and vaccine shortage. So in this background of fight, which is actually not just against COVID, it is multi-pronged fight. We all need to be together in this fighting against all these things. Before I go into my topic, there is a forewarning and a disclaimer. The basic etiquette, that is of masking, hand hygiene, social distancing, and vaccination. It is a must. All of them go hand in hand, and we cannot have one without the other. And the recommendations are constantly changing on a daily basis. The WHO's, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, the national guidelines, each of them keep changing. And as doctors, I think it's very important that we keep abreast of what is changing. So then we have to follow at least the WHO guidelines, and for pregnant and lactating mothers, for women are FOGSI guidelines, then the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare guidelines, and finally the local guidelines when it comes to lockdown and things like that. And most importantly, because there's so much of disinformation and misinformation, it's very important that we sit with the patient as healthcare providers and discuss all the pros and cons with them when there are gray areas. And then it's very important. We may be, all of us are getting calls about the symptoms of our relatives or friends, and it's very important to tell them not to ignore the symptoms. Because of fear, it's quite possible that patients say, I was sitting underneath the fan, or I drank cold water and that's why I have a cold. But that's not the thing in a pandemic. The first thing you think about is could this be COVID? And therefore, it's always important that we create this awareness amongst the patients, not to ignore the symptoms or self-medicate or follow, most importantly, unverified social media advice. So with that, I will go into the main topic of today, that is vaccination. I would like to take a single minute to just impress on you how much of work it takes to develop a vaccine. It starts with the discovery and target validation. That is, if they have an infection which is of public health importance, the scientists go and think about, can we develop a vaccine for this so that it helps in the prevention and control of this disease? So that's where it all starts. And then the preclinical stage, of course, in the laboratory where they're working on lab animals or tissues. And then they find that, yes, it is possible. They go into the bioprocess of formulation and also analytics. And then the clinical assay. How do you say that this vaccine is working? Should we do a blood test? Should we do this test? All that. And please note, just this stage takes about 3 to 8 years. Only after all this does it go to the human trials. And even in the human trials, you have the phase 1 trials, which includes tens of people, phase 2 trials, which includes hundreds of people, and phase 3 trials, which includes thousands of people. And then after all this, after all compiling the data and the statistics, then is the review. That is the regulatory review. Can we release it to the market, and what is the ethics behind it? What all those things, and that takes some more years. Just the regulation, even after the phase 3, the regulation may take about 1 to 2 years. So going by this, a vaccine actually takes 6 to 20 years to develop. If this timeline sinks into our mind, then only we can appreciate how much of work has gone into developing this COVID vaccine. Not 1, not 2, not 3. We have a basket of vaccines now, and all of the scientists have worked so much for it, and we really owe it to them, because the first case was officially reported on 30th November 2019, and the first jab was given on 14th December 2020. So just about 12 months and 15 days, and the vaccine was ready. So this is the background of how the COVID vaccine was developed. Now, I will be talking more about the vaccines that are available in India today. That is the Covishield vaccine, which is a viral vector vaccine. I am sure all of you know what's a viral vector. That's just they're taking the coat of a virus. And here in Covishield, it is the chimpanzee adenovirus, and it gets modified so that it is unable to cause the disease. And on the other side, we take the mRNA strand from the SARS-CoV-2 virus, clip away everything except that part which is capable of producing immunity. Okay, the gene sequence it and put that into the chimpanzee adenovirus. So the coat is the chimpanzee adenovirus, and inside you have the mRNA that is capable of eliciting an immune response to the spike protein. So this is the basis of Covishield. And when once it is injected into the human body, we are able to produce the antibodies against the spike protein. This is the broad basis of developing the Covishield. Now, as we go, I will tell you about Covaxin and also the Sputnik V. Now, Covishield developed by Serum Institute of India. The know-how is from AstraZeneca UK. It's a viral vector, chimpanzee adenovirus with spike protein producing gene. Covaxin by our own Bharat Biotech, make in India. It's an inactivated SARS-CoV-2 virus. They've taken the SARS-CoV-2 virus, grown it on Vero cell lines, and doused it with chemicals so that the virus dies but retains its immunogenic capacity. Sputnik V developed in Russia. It's a human adenovirus vaccine. So here we were using the chimpanzee adenovirus. Here the human adenovirus has been used. And very interestingly, the 2 doses of Sputnik have 2 different strains of adenoviruses. And the dosage of all these 3 vaccines, 2 doses. And Covishield is a gap of 12 to 16 weeks. That is the latest recommendation. Initially, it came with a recommendation of about 1 month or 4 to 5 or 4 to 6 weeks. Covaxin is 4 to 6 weeks, and Gamaleya or the Sputnik V vaccine is 21 days. Now, coming to the efficacy of these vaccines. Word about efficacy. When we say a vaccine is 95% effective, it does not mean that if 100 people take it, it's effective only in 95%. It means that if a person who's been vaccinated is exposed 100 times, he will be protected 95% of the times. So that is the vaccine efficacy. And as of date, no vaccine in the world is 100% effective. But however, these vaccines will reduce the severity of the disease. It's well known that vaccines will reduce the severity of the disease. Okay, so the efficacy of Covishield is around 76% after the 22 days. After 22 days, after the first dose. And if the second dose is given after 12 weeks, the efficacy is about 81%. And Covaxin, 78 to 81%. Here, I would like to tell you that Covaxin is still in the phase 3 trials. It's supposed to get over sometime in this May, and the 78 to 81% is the interim reporting. Similarly with Sputnik also. So Covaxin is in the phase 3 trials, and the interim report says that it is about 78 and 81%. And Sputnik, they are claiming 100% effective against moderate and severe disease and 91.6% against symptomatic cases. Storage is a very big problem as a headache when it comes to a subtropical country like India. So we are very used to dealing with vaccines because we have vaccinated millions of children. So we know how to maintain the cold storage if it is between 20 and 8 degrees Celsius. So that is why Covishield and Covaxin have found their places in India today. And Sputnik is about 2 to 8 degrees. Now, if we compare these vaccines to the vaccines that are available world over, the Moderna and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, it looks too good to be true because these are mRNA vaccines. They have been developed with a special technology. There's a huge story behind the woman who developed this mRNA vaccine, but that's beyond the scope of this talk. So this vaccine is now even being touted. The mRNA vaccine may become the answer for cancer vaccine also. But the only drawback with this is it requires stringent storage. Pfizer is minus 70 degrees and Moderna is minus 25 to minus 15 degrees, which may not be possible in a country like India, but definitely their efficacy is over 90%. Another vaccine that is on the focus is the Janssen by Johnson & Johnson, which is a viral vector vaccine, and it is also a single dose and see the storage 2 to 8 degrees. Probably this could also be welcome in India, but we have to wait and see. But whatever it is, there is no live attenuated COVID-19 vaccine in the world right now. So we have either the viral vector or inactivated virus or the mRNA vaccines. Now the vaccination status in India, I've picked it up today this morning from the government of India. it is about 19 crores. 19 crore people have been vaccinated, but still that translates to only about 13 or 14% of the total Indian population. And that is from January. Remember, January 16th was the time we started having the vaccination for healthcare workers. So from January 16th to May 16th, for a period of 4 months, it's only 13% of the population is being vaccinated. So if these numbers sink into us, we know what an enormous work we have to do about vaccination. Then today I'll be speaking more about the vaccination in pregnancy, of course. This is the UK info sheet that I took it up, and that is the latest on 14th May. Now, the benefits of taking vaccination in pregnancy. Now, pregnant women, they are susceptible to COVID as much as anybody else, non-pregnant people. But the severity of COVID in pregnancy is more than in non-pregnant. So therefore, taking a vaccine in pregnancy prevents the severity because they are more prone to have a severe disease. So it reduces the severity, especially in the third trimester. And the severity will be doubled, or not doubled exactly, it will be more if it is associated with comorbidities. And we all know COVID infection in pregnancy causes prematurity and fetal loss. We are seeing during the second wave especially. So we are preventing that. And also indirectly, we are reducing the transmission to the contacts. These are the benefits. Now the risks is the COVID vaccines not tested specifically in pregnant women. This is the bias for most vaccines. When they bring it out for human trials, pregnant women are excluded from it. So it's not been tested specifically in pregnant women. The only record we have is in the US, where 100,000 women have already received, pregnant women have received either Pfizer or Moderna with no adverse effect. But we are still awaiting more information. We do not know, we are still exploring how effective it is in pregnancy and what are the pregnancy outcomes after vaccination. These reports are still awaited because they started vaccinating sometime in December. So it's an ongoing process. And I must tell you about this rare but serious cases of thrombosis that has been reported, especially with the AstraZeneca vaccine. They have reported about the rate comes up to about 11 per 1 million. And therefore, they say it's not a significant risk. But considering that pregnancy is a thrombogenic state, we have to keep this in mind that especially AstraZeneca vaccine, especially after the first dose, there are reported cases of thrombosis. Though there are some papers that say it's only because of idiosyncrasy. It may not be really significant, but then this is something that we have to keep in our mind when we are suggesting vaccination to pregnant patients who are already in a thrombogenic status. Now, COVID vaccines in general, they do not contain any ingredients that are known to be harmful to pregnant women or to the developing baby. And the studies of the vaccine in animals to look at the effects on pregnancy have shown no evidence that vaccine causes harm to the pregnancy or even fertility. Vaccines work at any stage of pregnancy. And as I've already told you, there are no live attenuated vaccines. So no vaccine can cause COVID infection. If a patient or a person has taken the vaccine and then has got COVID, it means they took the vaccine during the incubation period of 2 to 12 days. Now, we have to know what is the vaccine recommendation process in India. It's not that, okay, the vaccine comes and we use it. The NEGVA, or the National Expert Group of Vaccine Administration of the Health Ministry, it reviews the recommendations before implementing it. The FOGSI and even the WHO has recommended vaccination to pregnant and also lactating mothers. Also, the National Technical Advisory Group on Immunization in India has also recommended that pregnant women be given the choice of taking any COVID vaccine and that lactating women are eligible. This is as of 13th May, just about a week back. But the government of India has allowed vaccination for lactating mothers. That was on the 19th of May, but has warned practitioners against advising vaccination for pregnant women as of 19th May 2021. Now, it's very interesting to see what the vaccine leaflet information says about usage in pregnancy and lactation. Covishield leaves it to the doctors to decide, giving no further information. Whereas Covaxin clearly states that pregnant and lactating women should not be taking this vaccine. Let us also have a look at the FOGSI position statement on COVID vaccination for pregnant and breastfeeding women. FOGSI acknowledges that protection from vaccination should definitely be extended to pregnant and lactating women. And it also acknowledges that benefits seem far more than the risks. And there is no known adverse effect on the neonate who is breastfeeding. In fact, it may be a passage of protective antibodies to the child, and it may be beneficial. Therefore, administering, monitoring, scheduling of vaccination should be the same for pregnant and lactating women as for the general population. FOGSI further says that the caregivers should counsel, support, and empower women to make their own decision. If a woman decides not to take a vaccine, we should not be discriminating her from somebody who is willing to take the vaccine. And we should be allowed to administer the COVID vaccines in pregnant and breastfeeding women with preparations to manage adverse events. This is like for anybody else. And as the infection is possible even after vaccination, as I've already told, masking, social distancing, and hand washing is definitely recommended. Now, the FOGSI position statement on periconception and fertility treatment. Vaccine administration in the preconception period or for women undergoing fertility treatment, including assisted reproduction. They should take the vaccine at any point of time before a pregnancy is confirmed, as and when they want. They have an opportunity to do so. There's no basis for deferring the pregnancy or treatment for taking the vaccine. They should not say, okay, I'm planning a pregnancy, so I won't take the vaccine now. No, they can take the vaccine. And there is no evidence that vaccine administration affects fertility or miscarriage rates. I think FOGSI is very clear on this point. And pregnancy testing before administering the vaccine is not necessary and therefore is not recommended because it just creates more complications. And what about vaccine if it is administered inadvertently to a pregnant woman? As of 18/5 to 2021, there is no known teratogenic effects as per available evidence. And if inadvertently vaccinated, we should not advise termination of pregnancy. And we should tell them that the risk of having a malformed baby is just similar to the background risk. But when you're offering the vaccination to someone who is pregnant, you can offer to them after 12 weeks. Okay, it's prudent to defer the vaccination in the first trimester as still there is no substantial available data to establish even absence of teratogenicity. No known teratogenicity, but we also don't know. So it's advisable that you tell them, okay, so you can take it maybe at the 13th week. And finally, this most important slide, FOGSI position statement on Government of India. At the present time, it is emphasized that individual practitioners cannot advise vaccination to pregnant women in India until there is a change in recommendations from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India. Now, what does WHO say? WHO acknowledges that pregnancy puts a woman at higher risk, but there is very little data to assess vaccine safety in pregnancy. But it also says that maybe the benefits are more than the risks. And it says that high-risk pregnant women, especially healthcare workers, those with comorbidities, may be vaccinated in consultation with the healthcare providers. And as per lactation, we do not know if vaccines are excreted through breast milk. Developmental and health benefits of breastfeeding to be considered, along with the mother's clinical need for immunization against COVID. It does not recommend discontinuing breastfeeding after vaccination. And finally, as of yesterday, that is 21/5/2021, WHO has finally left it to the countries. It says that after trials are completed, each country to review and approve its vaccines. And once it approves the vaccine continues to be monitored for safety and effectiveness. One minute. Next slide. I think something is hanging here. I'm not able to go to the next slide. Yeah. So a word about how it is in US and also UK. In UK, a very small number of women became pregnant after they received the AstraZeneca vaccine in a trial, but there was no signs of problem so far. And now, as of I think 14th May 2021, pregnant women are being offered the Pfizer BioNTech or Moderna vaccine. And also those who are below 40 are being offered this because of the small risk of thrombosis with AstraZeneca vaccine. In the United States, they have the nice mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna, and over 100,000 pregnant women have been vaccinated. And this has not raised any safety concern, but they have to be monitored. And finally, the vaccination FAQs. The registrations are compulsory. Suppose in the future date, the Indian government approves vaccination. What should we be doing? They should be registering compulsorily. And this is very important, especially for pregnant women, the wait period before vaccination, because we are giving them TD, we are giving them Tdap. So 14 days before or after vaccination. So if you have given them any tetanus vaccination today, you should be deferring the vaccine for about 14 days or even vice versa. Someone who's had COVID, they have to wait for 90 days. And there is the word going on that government may extend it up to 180 days also. And someone who has received monoclonal antibodies and plasma for COVID, they also have to wait for about 19 days. And very importantly, if somebody is having upper respiratory symptoms, it's better that skip the schedule of vaccination, wait until they confirm or refute that it is COVID. Similarly, if they have been exposed to a patient with COVID, they have to wait till the quarantine is over. This is very important when we are going to be telling our patients in future when the government of India approves the vaccination, if at all. We have to call for caution when there is allergy to the ingredients. So we have to, the patient should know, or we should elicit from the patient if she's allergic to any of those ingredients, especially those carriers. As such, the virus may not elicit, but they may be allergic to those ingredients. And hemophilia and thrombocytopenia, because the injection is being given intramuscular, it's for caution only. It's not, however, contraindicated. And finally, when they go for vaccination, it's also very important, not just for pregnant patients, but for the general people, that they stick to the schedule, and they should not stick to the schedule if they are sick. That's very important because they'll be exposing the others in the vaccination area also to infection. They have to continue the routine medications. If these women are diabetic or hypertensive, they're taking those medicines, let them continue. Wear the right clothes so that vaccination is easy. Mask, social distancing, and hand sanitizer should not be forgotten. And most importantly, when any of us go to the when any of them go to the vaccination center, no shop, no talk at all. They wear the mask, don't talk, and no eating, drinking, or even removing the mask, and no selfies with masks off. And finally, they should ensure that they get a vaccinated card, because in future, if they want to travel abroad, they need the vaccinated card. So this is about all about vaccination. And now we come to the last part, that is the masking. Most of you will be aware of it. I'll just touch on the few points that we have to notice always. And one thing is, if a patient is COVID positive and she's breastfeeding the baby, she has to follow the mask etiquette more carefully than ever. So just because she's recovering from COVID, we cannot deprive the baby of breast milk. So when she's wearing that, she has to be very careful, because the handler is there and the baby is there. So the masks, all of us know, if the highest transmission is when both of us, when the carrier as well as the other person, they are not wearing the masks. That is, when the carrier is not wearing the mask, there's 70% probability, whereas when both of them are wearing the mask, it is about 1.5%. And finally, there is no chance of transmission if both of them are staying at home during the lockdown. Then just about this mask differences, there is the cloth mask, there is the surgical mask, the 3-layered mask, and also the N95 masks. The cloth mask is usually for dust and pollen, so it has no protection from bacteria and also viruses. Whereas this surgical face mask, to some extent, the bacteria and also some extent, maybe not at all, about the viruses. The N95 mask is the mask that is protective against viruses, and that N95 means 95% of viruses can be filtered. So there is still that 5%. Most importantly, the face mask should be used correctly, as you all know, over the nose, mouth, and also the chin, and it should have a snug fit. So much so that during the first wave in UK, they advised all the men to be clean shaven so that the mask sits right on their face in the right way. A loose fitting mask is not very effective at all. So there's one more tip. When you're using the surgical mask, if you want it to be tight, I'm sure you would have got many WhatsApp forwards. You just have to twist the end over and then put it across on your ear so that it fits snugly. As of today, there is no official recommendation for double masking, but there was some word going on during the peak that they may recommend double masking. Double masking is nothing but using a cloth mask, and cloth mask also should be 2-layered, using a cloth mask and over that using the surgical mask. So we won't be surprised if they recommend the double masking sometime later. And the cloth mask can be washed and reused, whereas the other two is preferably one-time use and disposable. And finally, a word about the do's, and this is straight from the WHO side. The hands should be washed before touching the mask. Inspect the mask well before wearing it, and find the top side, fit it snugly over the face, and the metal piece or the stiff edge must be pinched over the nose so that it is a snug fit. And once you have adjusted the mask, please don't touch the surface of the mask. And even when you're removing the mask, it should be with the strings. And here they have shown the discard mask immediately, but it has to be put in a cover and then discarded. And then you wash your hands after discarding the mask. Yeah, just one more slide and I'm done with. Finally, the don'ts of course, don't use a ripped or a damp mask. Don't wear the mask. Oh, you all must have seen people wearing it underneath their nose or even the chin. And those people wearing it on the chin, 100% they'll be infective, because the virus may go and sit on the chin. They pull it down and the virus sits on the inner aspect. They put it back up and it's a sure short way of getting infected. So the mask, if it has to be worn, it has to be worn correctly. And then, of course, you cannot interchange the mask, and don't reuse a disposable mask. So again, stressing that mask alone will not help, vaccination alone will not help. It is a collective effort, and masking, sanitization, social distancing, and vaccination. This is the only way, at least for now, that we can combat the pandemic. And I'm very fond of this asterisk, and here is the asterisk versus pandemics, where he's saying all together, all apart, hold it off till the magic potion is ready. Look at them so beautifully, they are having the social distancing, and here somebody is making the COVID vaccine. So let's all hope that there will be a day when this kind of interaction will be on site. And thank you all for listening to me. And if there are any questions, I'll take it in the chat box. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shantala. That was really a vast information regarding the vaccination, especially during pregnancy and lactation, and also the most important information regarding the masking. Would you, shall we go to the...
I have a few questions to Shantala.
Yes, ma'am.
Is there time? Okay. The leaflet shows Covaxin not to be given, no?
Yeah. Yeah.
Ma'am, can we take the questions in the end?
There will be many questions for vaccine and other
Okay.
Last questions.
Sure.
So thank you, Dr. Shantala. That was a wonderful talk and most awaited for all the OBGYNs.
Okay, now we move on to the next important topic. And the speaker is none other than our dynamic president, Dr. Padmini Prasad. Dr. Padmini Prasad.
Yes, ma'am. Continue.
Yes. Dr. Padmini Prasad is going to talk about pro and prebiotics in genital infections. She needs no introduction. She's well known in our faculty of OB/GYN. She's a senior obstetrician and gynecologist, and she has selected a unique subspecialty, sexology and marriage counselor. And we have listened to many of her talks, and they were all very enlightening, and how she incorporates that sexual health is very important, and that question should be a part of each and every examination. She's the first qualified woman sexologist from Karnataka, and she's the medical director of Ramamani Nursing and Maternity Home, diplomate of American Board of Sexology, and she's the only diplomate from Karnataka, and we are proud of you, Dr. Padmini. She is a member of the World Association for Sexual Health, International Society for Sexual Medicine, and Director of Sexual Medicine, Bangalore. She was the Vice President of VSOG and also Family Planning Association of India. She's a gold medalist from MD for MD Obstetrics Gynecology and recipient of numerous awards and felicitations. The prestigious Rajyotsava, Kempegowda, Rani Chennamma, etc. from Government of Karnataka. She also got the Golden Lamp Award, Silver Lamp Award from CSCPI. She has authored 11 books on sexual and reproductive health, and we have been listening to all her interesting talks with Kasoga in the recent past few months. She has been regularly featured on television and radio on sexual and reproductive health awareness programs. We are very proud and happy to welcome you, Dr. Padmini, and she's going to give a talk on pro and prebiotics. And pro and prebiotics, until recently, they were not given much importance, but now we know right from infection, right up to neoplasm, the prevention of colon cancer, prevention of infection, prevention of allergies, prevention of autoimmune. It has got so much role to play. So this is a very good topic, which will be very useful for us. So without wasting much time, I request Dr. Padmini Prasad to deliver her lecture on pre and probiotics in genital infections.
Ellarigu namaskara. Thank you very much, Dr. Uma Devi, for that kind introduction. Good evening to you all. I thank BSOG and Sun Pharma for this opportunity to be with you all to participate in this webinar. Thank you, chairpersons. I will just put it on the full screen. So today we are here, we are learning about the good friends who are part of our body. We are discussing about the microbiota of the vagina and its influence on women's health and disease. It has been recognized that humans coexist with complex bacterial communities. These organisms and communities called microbiome have evolved with us over thousands of years. They are critical to our survival, and any disturbance may result in disease. Microbiota research has resulted in new knowledge concerning vaginal microbiota and its role in reproductive health. Vaginal flora or the vaginal microbiome are the microorganisms that colonize vagina. So we have microbiota in the mouth, in the gut, and in the vagina. Albert Doderling in 1892 itself discovered lactobacillus.
Madam,
yes. And I am
change,
not,
slides
I am
change
not
after,
moving the child. I am just giving the introduction. Just
okay, ma'am. Okay, fine.
This vaginal microbiota has its role in vaginal infection, genital infection, urinary tract infections, infertility, IVF success rate, preterm labor, premature rupture of membranes, etc. So these probiotics are nothing but the live beneficial bacteria, and prebiotics are the food for probiotics, food for these live beneficial bacteria. So if this, with this introduction, if you understand this, then all this, I think it is a gist of all this what I am going to tell. So in the normal vaginal flora, the lactobacillus are the predominant organism, that is 95% of it. The ratio of anaerobes to aerobes is 2:1 to 5:1. Gardnerella vaginalis, mobilincus present in there, the other organisms. Some hydrogen peroxide producing bacteria are also present, and they maintain the vaginal pH and provide protection against infectious bacteria. Any change in the vaginal flora, the few hydrogen peroxide producing lactobacillus or Gardnerella vaginalis, mobilincus or mycoplasma can be present whenever there is a change in the vaginal flora. The normally commensal bacteria communities under certain circumstances become pathogenic if a shift in the equilibrium favors their competitiveness. Dynamic equilibrium of the vaginal microbiome can be altered by environmental factors and external interferences. The antibiotics, the vaginal hygiene, because so many will have the habit of causing vaginal douches, applying antiseptics and deodorants, etc. And the sexual intercourse, the hormone therapy, all these things can disturb the equilibrium. These alterations can result in microbial imbalances or dysbiosis in the urogenital tract. Urogenital infections such as vulvovaginal candidiasis, bacterial vaginosis, and urinary tract infections affect billions of women each year, resulting in considerable morbidity and healthcare costs. So the vaginal infections can be the fungal infection or the bacterial infection, fungal caused by the Candida albicans and others. The bacterial infections caused by Gardnerella vaginalis, Mycoplasma, Peptostreptococcus, Ureaplasma, and Mobilincus and such other things. So the risk factors include for bacterial vaginosis, low socioeconomic status, vaginal douching, smoking, new or multiple sex partners, or unprotected intercourse. The vulvovaginal candidiasis can be caused by recent antibiotic use, pregnancy, uncontrolled diabetes mellitus, AIDS, corticosteroid use, and other immunosuppression. So the pathogens, this is characterized by a shift in the vaginal flora, and these are the various things which I enumerated earlier. So there are the pathogens and the lactobacillus. So from the normal flora, if there is a change in pH, so increasing pH can cause increasing infection and increasing the symptoms because of the infection. So this is a diagram showing dysbiosis. Whenever there is eubiosis, the lactic acid production where the pH is less than 4.5 causes suppression of other endogenous bacteria and even this viscoelastic mucus and the selection for acid tolerant bacteria because of the lactic acid, and the glycogen breakdown is the one which leads to lactic acid production. So this causes non-inflammatory environment. So other conditions where there is loss of bacterial integrity, pro-inflammatory environment because of the acetate production, propionate, butyrate and succinate, where the pH becomes more than 4.5 and production of amines, and the instead of anaerobic bacteria, mucin breakdown and discharge. There will be an increase in the discharge, and the amines and other things will cause malodor and also loss of integrity. So this bacterial vaginosis, the common vaginal dysbiosis among women of reproductive age, most common cause of abnormal vaginal discharge, and symptomatic bacterial vaginosis is also characterized by vaginal malodor, increased vaginal pH, and also vaginal itching. So most cases of the bacterial vaginosis, the predominant microbe is facultative anaerobe Gardnerella vaginalis. So the adherence of virulent Gardnerella vaginalis to the vaginal epithelial cells will cause replication and biofilm formation by consuming vaginal mucosal proteins that will enhance endurance against lactobacilli. So these adherent cells, these are known as the clue cells, because of pore formation in the vaginal epithelium. And the fishy amine vaginal odor is because of this biofilm and then consuming the vaginal mucosal proteins. And the enhanced endurance against lactobacillus attraction due to other anaerobic organisms because of the deficiency of lactobacillus and increase in the vaginal pH. The recurrence rates are up to 15 to 30% have been reported at 3 months and 28% over 6 months. As many as 50% of women with bacterial vaginosis experience recurrence within 1 year of treatment. Some reasons for recurrence include persistent of residual infection, resistance, and possibly reinfection from either male or female partners. The exact mechanism of recurrence is also not fully understood. What are these bacterial biofilms? These are defined as any group of microorganisms in which cells stick to each other on a surface. Asymptomatic women have very thin and sometimes loose vaginal biofilms, whereas women with bacterial vaginosis tend to have thick adherent biofilms. So if there is a thick layer, it is difficult for the antibiotics to penetrate into the cells and clear the infections. That is the reason why if there is thick biofilm or a thin biofilm, we will have problem. Certain species such as Gardnerella vaginalis and A. vagina have been proposed as primary and secondary biofilm colonizers. Antibiotic therapy based on metronidazole or clindamycin is incapable to completely eradicate the biofilms, so that it will cause high recurrence rates of BV. In addition, prolonged antibiotic therapy can harm the healthy vaginal microbiota. These issues generated the interesting emerging different therapeutic strategies such as the use of probiotics and prebiotics. So only with the antibiotics where the penetration is not possible and complete eradication of the infection is not possible, which is responsible for, so to know whether there are any other things which can help in the treatment of these conditions. The vulvovaginal candidiasis is the second most common infection after BV, caused by overabundant growth of yeast cells belonging to Candida species in the vagina. It affects 3 out of 4 women in their lifetime. More than 40% of affected women have 2 or more episodes. Infection more common in pregnant women. Infective organism is fungus that reproduces by budding. So other organisms include other types of Candida. Commonest is the Candida albicans. So this is other described earlier, how it proliferates and gets adherent to that and produces all the discharge. So the differential diagnosis, when you come to that, the normal bacterial vaginosis and vulvovaginal candidiasis. In the normal, the vaginal pH is 3.8 to 4.2 and discharge is thin, white and flocculent and amine odor is absent. Microscopy, it shows lactobacilli and epithelial cells. Whereas in bacterial vaginosis, the vaginal pH is more than 4.5, thin milky white gray discharge, fishy odor, and presence of clue cells, adherent cocci, no WBCs, scarce or no lactobacilli. In vulvovaginal candidiasis, the vaginal pH can be less than 4.5, but there is white, curdy, cottage cheese discharge and amine odor is absent. You can see budding yeast hyphae in microscopy. So what are these therapeutic options that we have right now? So initial regimens, bacterial vaginosis, we have metronidazole or the flagyl, which we have 500 milligram orally twice daily for 7 days, or metronidazole 0.75% gel, 1 full applicator intravaginally daily for 5 days. Clindamycin 2% cream, 1 full applicator intravaginally at bedtime for 7 days. The alternative regimens include tinidazole 2 gram orally once daily for 2 days, or tinidazole 1 gram orally once daily for 5 days, clindamycin 300 milligrams orally twice daily for 7 days, or clindamycin 100 milligram intravaginally at bedtime for 3 days. If there is pregnancy, metronidazole can be given 500 milligram orally twice daily for 7 days. The first recurrence, retrial of same regimen or trial of alternative initial regimen. Multiple recurrences where metronidazole gel can be used intravaginally twice weekly for 4 to 6 weeks. So for the vulvovaginal candidiasis, we have topical azole therapy, fluconazole, 150 milligram orally single dose. Topical therapy applied intravaginally for 7 days. To achieve mycologic cures, topical therapy for 7 to 14 days can be used, or fluconazole 150 milligram orally every third day for 3 doses. For maintenance, oral fluconazole 100 milligram, 150 milligram or 200 milligram weekly for 6 months can be used, so that it along with that topical treatment also can be used. Aerobic vaginitis. This is defined by disruption in lactobacillus dominance, but is accompanied by more extreme inflammatory changes than bacterial vaginosis. It is caused by aerobic bacteria, including group B Streptococcus, Enterococcus, E. coli, and Streptococcus aureus. Signs and symptoms include yellow-green discharge, vagina is red by inflammation, pH is 5.5 to 6.5, many toxic leukocytes, parabasal cells are seen. This has been observed in 8 to 11% of pregnant women and in 5 to 24% of women reporting vaginal complaints. This aerobic vaginitis versus bacterial vaginosis. Earlier, even this bacterial vaginitis is what it was known as. Later, now it is the term used is bacterial vaginosis because there are multiple organisms inside. So aerobic vaginitis characteristics include the pH is more than 4.5, usually more than 6, yellowish discharge, epithelial inflammation is present, they shed parabasal cells, and Whiff's test, which is known to cause the fishy amine odor can be detected by this test, is negative. Lactobacillus is displaced. The group B Streptococcus or E. coli and Staphylococcus aureus can be seen in the microbiological study. Immunological inflammatory cytokines and immune reaction is very high. Treatment includes kanamycin, clindamycin, fluoroquinolones, that is ciprofloxacin or volfloxacin. In bacterial vaginosis, I earlier described all this. I don't think there is need to repeat it. The urinary tract infection. All around the world, it is estimated that several 100 million women suffer from UTI. It can be another casualty of an unhealthy urogenital microbiota. Multiple risk factors predisposed to UTI include sexual intercourse with multiple partners, exposure to spermicidal agents. The spermicides lead to loss of lactobacilli and an increase in pH, which stimulates the growth of gram-negative organisms and subsequent UTI. E. coli is the organism responsible for the largest proportion of symptomatic UTI in women. The vaginal dysbiosis and UTI, how they are connected. Depletion of lactobacilli or imbalance between lactobacilli and uropathogens have been documented in patients with UTI. Vagina is a key anatomical site in the pathogenesis of UTI, serving as a potential reservoir infecting bacteria. So many times when we are treating recurrent urinary tract infections, we always look into the genital origin and treat that. So it can be cervicitis, erosion, and vaginal infections. When you treat that, most of the time, even the urinary tract infection can be taken care of. So multiple culture-based studies showed that women with recurrent UTI often have increasing of colonization with E. coli and depletion of normally predominant H2O2 producing lactobacilli. So treatment is currently centered on the use of antibiotics. A short course of antibiotics is treatment of choice for acute symptomatic UTI. Postcoital or monthly courses of antibiotics are used as prophylaxis against recurrent UTI. The rising rates of antibiotic resistance coupled with increasing UTI recurrence called for development of new and effective treatment strategies to combat their prevalence. Dysbiosis in pregnancy, how it can affect. The vaginal microbiome undergoes significant changes during pregnancy by increased stability, a decrease in overall diversity and predominance of lactobacillus species. Any pathologic changes in their profile may make the vagina susceptible to infections. Microbiome may also change with environment, weight, diet pattern, and hormonal milieu. Thus, immunological, endocrinological, and metabolic changes during pregnancy can cause significant alterations in the microbiome. These changes may make a woman susceptible to genital tract infections, which can result in adverse gestational outcomes like preterm birth and pregnancy complications. Etiology of preterm birth is multifactorial, but it has been estimated that about 1/3 of cases is due to intrauterine inflammation caused by the ascending vaginal infections. So infection-induced inflammatory pathways are thought to be the causal driver of around 40% of preterm births and of as many as 80% of early preterm births before 28 weeks of gestation. Bacterial vaginosis is an important and independent risk factor for preterm birth. So ascending intrauterine infection earlier in gestation accounts for about 50% of spontaneous abortions. Abnormal vaginal microbiota, ascending infection, bacterial colonization of deciduous fetal membranes, and microbial invasion of amniotic cavity can release pro-inflammatory cytokines and chemokines, prostaglandins, and metalloproteases and CRH, which are responsible for uterine contractions, membrane activity, and labor. So this is a schematic representation of dysbiosis and preterm birth, which I explained just now. So in reproductive outcome, an increasing number of studies have highlighted the correlation between infertility and microbiome. Many researchers have noticed that infertile women host a different microbiota. Vaginal dysbiosis is also associated with infertility, adverse reproductive outcomes, and clinical outcomes in women undergoing IVF. Especially, bacterial vaginosis is linked to infertility and adverse clinical outcomes. In infertile women, the prevalence of BV was found to be 19%, whereas the prevalence of abnormal microflora, including BV and interim microflora, was reported to be 39%. A high prevalence of bacterial vaginosis and abnormal vaginal microbe was reported in patients. These are all IVF outcome studies. And these are all the other studies, high concentration of Gardnerella and other things where lactobacillus will be reduced. These are all the studies suggesting that vaginal dysbiosis may negatively impact IVF pregnancy rates. So the probiotics, I was explaining to you, these are all live organisms, microorganisms, which have got a beneficial effect whenever there is lots of lactobacillus. If we are able to replace it with a good bacteria in these conditions, whether we can have any other good outcome. That is the things which led to the discovery of probiotics and prebiotics, which help or which feed probiotics. So these are the Florida, they have conducted the studies. The disadvantages of the current treatment options, up to 10 to 15% of patients fail to respond to initial antimicrobial therapy, and recurrence rates over time among responders remain significant, reaching up to 80%, necessitating repeated administration of antibiotics. Such repeated antibiotic exposure increases the risk of emergence of resistant strains, alteration of microbiota, and possible persistence of pathogens. So rationale for probiotics include maintenance of healthy vaginal flora is paramount in achieving vaginal and urinary tract health. Vaginal microbiota is a complex structure that can change quickly and dramatically and significantly impact a woman's health. New health maintenance and disease treatment approaches are badly needed, and probiotics should be considered. Recurrent infection may also be due to elimination of the commensal organisms in the vagina. The antimicrobial therapy, thereby increasing susceptibility to recolonization by pathogens. This is one of the main reasons for considering the use of probiotics to replenish the microbes as a way to lower the risk of reinfection. Live microorganisms, which when administered in adequate amounts confer a health benefit on the host. So this is the concept of probiotics, which was told in 1905 itself. So the probiotics, according to WHO, are live microorganisms which when administered in normal amounts confer a health benefit on the host. Prebiotics are food ingredients that appear to stimulate the growth of beneficial bacteria in the gut tract. This contains some of this fructosol, ligosaccharide, and this you can get it in non-digestible fibers from the food, apple skin, garlic, onion, asparagus, and things like that. And Symbiotics is a product that contains both probiotics and prebiotics. Probiotics can be got from the culture and the normal fermentation of yogurt also, and they have cultured from the vagina itself and made into a powder which can be administered. So microorganisms which are used as probiotics include the lactobacillus, bifidobacterium, streptococcus, leuconostoc, and these are all the other names which we are not so very familiar, but it contains live organisms, useful or healthy organisms which can be used. Yeast and molds like Aspergillus and Candida, specially used in these conditions. In vaginal infections, probiotics have been shown to exert the beneficial effects both in foods such as yogurt and the supplements. Probiotic must have two criteria to be selected as an efficient strain in the treatment of urogenital infections. It must be able to colonize the host without any adverse side effects, and it must be capable of inhibiting urogenital pathogens. Probiotic bacteria are considered an alternative treatment choice for BV prevention. Probiotics have been documented to be beneficial in curing BV as well as reducing its recurrence. It has been administered both orally and vaginally. In the vaginal ecosystem, it is presumed that symbiotics have the capacity to optimize, maintain, and restore the natural microbiota of the vagina. So this Florita is one capsule which contains all these useful organisms. It helps to treat bacterial vaginosis, brings significant relief from associated symptoms like discharge, itching, odor, and pruritus, restores and maintains normal flora. A one capsule daily given for 1 week to 14 days is the dosage. And the lactic acid production, competition for adherence. The lactobacilli metabolize glycogen released from epithelial cells. This glycogen is degraded into glucose, which is fermented to lactic acid. Lactic acid is one that leads to a low pH of the vaginal secretions and thereby exerts antimicrobial activity against non-resident bacteria. Competition for adherence. Lactobacilli have been shown to interfere with the colonization of the pathogenic bacteria by blocking the attachment to the vaginal epithelium. And this is another way of, one is lactic acid production, preventing the biofilm, and the hydrogen peroxide production. Generally, it is produced by lactobacilli present in the normal biota of healthy women, which has got an antimicrobial property, antimicrobial effect, which can also prevent the infection. And this bacteriocin production is another method of preventing infection. That's why this microbiota are called the second defense systems in the body. The lactobacilli produce a variety of bacteriocins that inhibit the growth of bacterial vaginosis associated bacteria and other pathogens. So many times they have isolated bacteriocins from vaginal strain of lactobacillus, which shows inhibition of the growth of other things. So lactobacilli are able to inhibit pathogens in a direct manner by co-aggregation or by producing active components such as bacteriocins, lactic acid, and hydrogen peroxide. In addition, they promote the integrity of the epithelium by stimulating mucus secretion and modulating the immune response, which are indirect ways of inhibiting viral and bacterial pathogens. So inhibition of adhesions, lactic acid production, hydrogen peroxide production, co-aggregation molecules, bacteriocin production helps restore normal vaginal flora. So even in the preterm birth, protective action of probiotics against preterm birth, it starts preliminarily by avoiding the BV, which is primary barrier to prevent the ascending infection. Due to anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory properties, it can reduce systemic effect, which plays a central role in the cascade of events that lead to preterm labor. So this has also been used to avoid infection and to improve the IVF, success rate in the IVF. This has been used. So the prebiotic, which is non-digestible polysaccharides, promote growth of beneficial bacteria. It occurs naturally in medicinal plants such as onion, chicory, garlic, banana, among many others. It is used to improve dysbiosis by enhancing growth of bifidobacteria. It is also shown to decrease growth of potentially pathogenic and enhance the immunity. So in the vaginal ecosystem, this is very important. How do probiotics taken orally can colonize in the intimate sphere? So mouth is oral administration by mouth, passage in the stomach. Probiotics must resist gastric acid juices and enzymes. Passage in the gut. Probiotics get through the digestive tract. They must resist bile. So in the rectum, colonization occurs. Probiotics will grow up and then they arrive at the vulva. Probiotics colonize the perineum to reach the vulva where they will continue to grow up. Then they colonize the vagina. So in vitro studies were conducted for all the strains using stimulated gastric juice and intestinal juice, and survival rated were calculated. All the strains in formulation are stable and can survive transit through the gastrointestinal tract. So it goes through the gastrointestinal tract and then colonizes in the vagina. Probiotics are mostly considered to be safe. Lactobacillus species utility is related to their GRAS status, and these are all the studies. And one thing is probiotics, because they contain live organisms, so we had to be careful when we are giving it to immunosuppressed patients or immunocompromised patients, those who are on steroids, having HIV/AIDS, and there are certain conditions which are also contraindicated for probiotics. These are all the clinical evidence. I will not go into the detail. These are all the results which shows that there is a beneficial effect by using that. So the potential probiotic capsule is safe and quite effective in minimizing the vaginal infections and consequent symptoms such as increased discharge, odor, color of discharge, and pruritus. Oral supplementation of probiotic capsule could be a solution for the efficient treatment of bacterial vaginosis. So the prevention of these are all again the studies. Oral probiotics could be an alternative, side effect free treatment for one of the most common indications in gynecology, combining the good aspects of both metronidazole and vaginal capsules. So this is in summary. Urogenital infections such as bacteriovaginosis and other infections affect billions of women each year. For patients suffering from these infections, they have an increased risk of preterm labor and acquire sexually transmitted disease. It is also associated with infertility, adverse reproductive outcomes, and clinical outcomes in women undergoing IVF. Although effective antimicrobial treatments are readily available, concerns mount about antibiotic cost, overuse or overexposure, sensitivity, and sequelae, including antibiotic resistance. Rationale for urogenital probiotics come from the belief that replenishing the normal vaginal flora will counter pathogens and lead to their return to the lactobacilli dominated state found in normal women. So they are commonly used choices for treating and preventing urogenital infections. And these are all the other things where the mode of action was described. Oral supplementation are particularly alluring because of their ease and high satisfaction versus the use of creams and gels. Florita consists of several strains of lactobacillus. Each bacilli contains a particular number of strains. All the strains in formulation are stable and can survive transit through the GIT. Further in vitro study also showed that strains in formulation are found to produce hydrogen peroxide, acetic acid, and lactic acid, which are antagonistic to pathogens. So these are all the studies. So now we could make out how there can be good bacteria which are good friends to us, which act as a second defense system, which can prevent so many of the complications and the recurrent infections, continued infections, antibiotic resistance, all that can be avoided. We can prevent the genital infections. We can improve the IVF success rate and infertility in infertile patients, and also prevent some of the pregnancy complications. All these things which have a root cause in reduction in the altered microbiota in the vagina. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, ma'am. That was.
Thank you, Dr. Padmini, for that clear and informative talk on pre and probiotics. You took us through from the basics of vaginal microflora to a condition where there is a recurrent vulvovaginal infection. And finally, there seems to be some hope for recurrent vulvovaginitis patients. And also you highlighted that it should be used cautiously in people who are immunocompromised because it's all live. That was a very important take-home message. And there are some questions in the chat box regarding like how many days it should be used.
Usually it is given in course of 14 days, it is usually given. And there is no harm in giving because it doesn't have so much of a side effect, they say. So along with the antibiotics or in current urinary tract infection, give a course of 1 BD capsule for 2 weeks course or 14 days course will definitely help.
Okay.
I think IVF center, Dr. Mahesh will can enlighten us. In IVF country, I have seen many people using this probiotics to prevent some of these vaginal infections and improve the vaginal flora.
Yes, only in those resistance cases wherein we have already given we've done the culture sensitivity and we have used the medications. Even then, if it's recurring or if it's not subsiding, only then we use. Otherwise, in all the cases, it's not really mandatory or required. Only in those cases wherein it's recurrent or it is coming even after treating it.
Actually, I have been using this since so many years. Usually, especially recurrent UTI and recurrent white discharge like bacterial vaginosis, recurrent pelvic inflammatory diseases, and also in pregnancy, many patients come with pathological white discharge. In those cases, I have been using it, so it has been proven beneficial to the patients.
What about these live bacteria being used in pregnancy? Is there any caution? Because these are live bacillus.
They have conducted studies. I think they have used it even in pregnancy because of the colonization. Yeah. It is not systematically observed. I don't know this. I'm not getting.
Because there is not much of.
No, they can make the stop sharing from there because I am not seeing the screen.
Okay. I think in probably somebody who's coming from very low socioeconomic status, they can use the fermented products. And as that Nobel Prize winner, H.T. Koffno in 1915, he only found out this. Yes. He himself introduced sour milk or sour diet, curds. And he found to be onions, asparagus, maybe all this in addition to these in resistant cases of recurrent infections. Maybe we can try, because some of the evidence are in gastrointestinal tract disorder shows level of evidence 2 and 1 in use of probiotics in diarrhea, in other conditions.
Knowingly or unknowingly, we are in our food systems, we have all that. We take curds and we use garlic,
onion, ginger, all.
So automatically we are, that's why we are keeping our health in there is no need to take separately as probiotic. Only in the infective conditions where this is not there, I think additional probiotics supplementation will be needed. Otherwise, that's why they even advise some of these sprinkling on the food and also on the salads about these probiotics, and those who do not consume all these things regularly in the food. Yeah. So that also has been discovered.
And you also highlighted that the youngsters using deodorants, washes, all those things to be avoided because they destroy the natural microflora. So natural microflora is very important, and unnecessarily it should not be destroyed.
So because most of the patients, they come and I repeatedly wash I am so clean, madam. I regularly wash with Dettol, Savlon and soap.
Dettol they use.
Yes. So that is also is not a good thing to do that.
See, as of now, I think probably we may not use it in pregnancy, but probably we can use it in recurrent vulvovaginitis, because pregnancy itself, there's not much of evidence that prevention of bacterial vaginosis, preterm birth and all that. So that I think lots of more studies will show evidence whether it is completely, we should use it or not, but probably in those cases of recurrent bacterial vaginosis, definitely there is a place for this bacteria.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Padmini.
Thank you.
And I think there are some questions for Dr. Shantala also.
One thing
Yeah,
one thing I want to tell that it is still not FDA approved
Yes.
for biotech usage.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of studies are conducted. We are finding the beneficial effect, but still that FDA approval has to come, I think. I don't know whether by this time it has come.
Okay, ma'am. Can I take the questions?
Yes.
Yes.
There are two people who have asked about safety of vaccine during lactation. It's actually all these vaccines. There's nothing like as of now, we say that the benefits of taking the vaccine is more compared to the risks of not taking the vaccine. Because even if it is being given in US in pregnant women, it is being followed up. So all we can say is COVID vaccine safe during lactation? Yes, it is now recommended and approved by the government of India also. So better to be safe than sorry. So you could take the vaccine. And then what precautionary measures need to be taken after taking vaccination for lactation women? No, when once the lactation women is almost same as the other general population. So there are no extra precautions to be taken as of now. There are no recommended extra precautions to be taken. And which vaccine is better? Like I always say, we are now beggars, we can't be choosers. Right now, we have only 3 vaccines available, and out of which Covishield, on the label only it has been recommended that you discuss with your healthcare providers, and Covaxin has said that we don't recommend it in your pregnancy and lactation, probably because they're still in the 3rd phase of trials. So we can expect a change in the recommendation over the next 1 or 2 months. But if Moderna and Pfizer were to come to India and being sold commercially, that would be the best bet for any pregnant or lactating women. So if you had a choice, if I had a choice, probably I would have opted for Moderna and Pfizer, but that's not available in India. So we have to settle down.
When can we expect that? Any idea?
No idea, because number
It
one,
has to be in very low storage, no, very
yes.
25.
No,
So
no,
there
no,
is no chance, no, we cannot even,
frozen state.
I
it
mean,
cannot-
expect that as
No.
of now.
No, actually, see, the first point is Indian government should approve whatever is available here, number one. Number two, even if they apply for import, it may take months together. So my, just an estimate, I don't know, it's a personal estimate, maybe in another 5-6 months, because India is such a big market, Moderna and Pfizer would not want to leave it, irrespective of the cold chain. So they would make arrangements to see that Indian market opens up. So maybe over 5 or 6 months, probably we can expect, but that really depends upon the government. It's very difficult to say.
The problem basically was they had already applied for licensing as an emergency usage, but then the indemnification was not agreed upon by them. In the sense, if there is any side effects or any problem in the future because of the vaccine,
True.
they were not not ready to take the liability arising out of any litigations, which Covishield and Covaxin agreed to take the blame or whatever the litigation comes out of this long-term effects of the vaccine also, because in the nascent stage. Those companies, I guess, they were not agreeing for this indemnification. That's why they were rejected, or even in fact, the Pfizer took back its application for emergency authorization of the usage. It happened almost 3-4 months back only. So it is they didn't. Government of India didn't want to take that risk of indemnifying them against whatever they use, because we don't know how far they are competent in their product. So government of India didn't want to take that risk, but then Covishield and Covaxin agreed that they will take the risk, so they were permitted. So same
But
thing
as
with
of now, people are preferring Covishield.
There's no
not a question of
preference. There's
preference.
no question of preference. Whatever
Question
you
of availability.
However, that is
Whatever is available, you will have to take. It's not a question of
See,
preference.
initially, we were not, until now, we are not able to give a consensus on this, because pregnant and lactating women were excluded from this
all
Covishield
the
and
studies,
Covaxin, all these studies.
yes, all the studies.
Similarly, it happened in the case of Moderna and Pfizer. But what happened is, inadvertently, some women got the vaccination and they were pregnant. Those large group of women were followed, and it was found that nothing has happened to them or to their babies.
That in the,
And
no,
it is
ma'am,
safe.
actually, AstraZeneca, there were not many people. There was only a few people who entered into the trial. took the vaccine and then found out they were pregnant. But so far nothing has happened. See, all the vaccines have started only since December. So December to May, we hardly about 5 or 6 months. We don't know the long-term effects and how effective it is. Is it as effective in the pregnant patient as it is in the non-pregnant patient? Because so much of physiological changes, we really don't know. And here there was a very nice suggestion. Can we straight away vaccinate women after they deliver? Something like, the rubella vaccine. Actually, that's a good suggestion. I think you vaccinate a woman immediately after delivery and then revaccinate, give the booster dose after 12 weeks or whatever.
Lactating mothers, again, they're still not given.
No, now it is approved, ma'am. The government
Now
of
it is
India has
approved, ma'am.
approved.
Only
Government of India has-
precaution, postpartum thrombosis, just give them the warnings.
Yes, of course. See,
And
always.
because you're giving the vaccine postpartum period, already thrombotic risk in pregnancy, plus you're adding this. So that rare case of that idiosyncratic reaction of the cerebral venous sinus thrombosis.
Yeah, that is why the
That is
vaccine is
already otherwise
recommended.
there in pregnancy as well.
Yes, Foxy and
Follow them
WHO
for
is
about
there in pregnancy.
6 weeks at least. Follow them carefully after the vaccination, so that any headache, vomiting, nausea, or any abdominal pain or anything, they can immediately give them the warning symptoms, and then you can
And
vaccinate.
whatever reactions have happened, the thrombotic reactions, they're all idiosyncratic reactions.
Yes.
They're not exactly adverse. So it's very specific to those people. So they're really not very sure whether it is a cognizable risk. But as Madam said, because pregnancy and postpartum, they are the thrombogenic states. So the patient should know for sure what she's getting into and then take the vaccine. And Dr. Pushpa Srinivas has said that initially they had taken the vaccine at 1 month a dose. Do we have to take it once again? As of now, nowhere has there been a recommendation of a booster dose, maybe after 6 months or 1 year. So we're all waiting to see when they will actually tell us for the booster dose. Is this going to be an yearly affair like the influenza vaccine? We really don't know. Or they may even say after 6 months, take the another jab, they may say. So all this is there. And also there is the mixing up of vaccines. There are some studies going on. They have taken some vaccine in the beginning and now they're taking the second vaccine. So we are not really sure how much each of the vaccine protects. And there are studies going on to see whether mixing up of these vaccines may also be helpful. And actually, initially, UK started it with this idea of, instead of giving 100% protection to 50% of people, let us give 100% protection to, let us give 50% protection to 100% of people. And that way we find that UK greatly reduced their infection rate by even giving the first dose of vaccine to all the people. And I've seen this is a success story with vaccination. And as far as possible, we really should promote vaccination in those people whom we can promote and whom the government of India is allowing us to promote.
And moreover about thrombotic studies, the thrombosis is actually, if you see, the Europeans had more of a thrombosis. Indians never had so many thrombotic episodes because Europeans were prone for thrombosis.
Yes, that is the idiosyncrasy.
And AstraZeneca had to stop the trial because of thrombosis.
Correct.
Then they themselves clarified that, even WHO clarified that the thrombotic incidents in Europe, whatever happens, the yearly incidents, whatever happened because of AstraZeneca vaccination is not more than that. So it's what regularly used to happen. It's just a coincidence between the vaccination with the thrombotic episodes, and then they resume the trial. Otherwise, they would not have done it. So in India, there are hardly any episodes of thrombotic episodes that we get to hear. Indians are not prone for the.
But all the same, I think we should inform the patient that this is there, your risk is this much. So, and if they are willing, they have to take. Dr. Parvati Jolly is asking us if Covaxin is safer than Covishield in pregnant women since there's no thrombogen. Ma'am, actually Covaxin is still in the 3rd phase of trial and it's supposed to get over sometime in May. So some people are saying, yes, Covaxin is the better vaccine than Covishield because even in terms of the interim report that has come 78 to 81% effective. Covishield actually was used in UK and that's why and Europe, and that's why they came to know about the thrombogenic effect. And so here, if we are not at all started even using either of the vaccines, there is no way to say whether Covaxin is safer for thrombogenic side effects. So,
So I think that we should start a questionnaire like of all the obstetricians and gynecologists using this Covaxin Covishield, follow up and make a registry, then we'll know the
ma'am,
guidelines.
that will happen only when the government of India gives the go. We
No,
are
they've
still
already
not using.
committed, no?
No, only for lactating women, not for
No.
pregnant women.
Yeah, at
There
least
is a recommendation.
They have to, yes, there is no recommend. In fact, they are
there's no-
saying do not recommend. They are saying do not recommend. We are
that is to be on the
warned.
safer side. Because
Whatever the
yeah.
reasons is best known to them. When our Foxy has recommended, and
Yes.
even WHO has not completely said yes, give it. They've only said you assess the risk, see the healthcare worker. If she's a healthcare worker or if she's got comorbidities, then maybe you could discuss with her. So WHO is also not very sure, not even for the Moderna and AstraZeneca and Pfizer.
Yes,
So,
but in our country, the risk of COVID is very high. Mortality due to COVID is much more.
that is known for
Yeah.
in pregnancy.
So
It's
I think
always
it's up
like
to
that. It is more
obstetrician to decide.
severe. So
This
we
is
cannot know, ma'am. We cannot promote it to them. We have to tell it to
not
them.
offer to them.
Yes,
The
offer it to
Foxy-
them.
Even the Foxy has given a statement that it can be given, but then government cannot take this risk because woman and child is a very sensitive issue. If something happens because of that, there will be political repercussions because of
Not
that.
only that, people will
it's more
stop
of a-
taking the vaccine. Others will stop taking the vaccine. So they don't probably.
But
don't
now
want to
people
say
are
that.
asking for it. Pregnant women are asking for it. Like since now they also see the news and all, wherein the news of like now it is allowed for pregnant and lactating women. They are asking like, can we go for it?
See, it's a
What
matter
do you
of,
say?
I think it's a matter of time before the government gives the go ahead. So what I am doing for my patients, because there is that 14-day gap, if they have taken TD now or Tdap now, there should be a 14-day gap. And now they're going, the vaccination is going by registration. So you always tell the patient, yeah, you register yourself maybe for 14 days or 3 weeks from now. And if you're due for the Tdap or TD vaccine, take it now. And then
that 14-day gap, that 14-day gap is not absolute.
ma'am, it is
If
actually,
there is a
it is
high
not,
risk of COVID,
no, ma'am, it
that
is
families,
actually,
many
no.
people are suffering.
No, it's
do
not
not
like
wait for the
that.
14 days.
It has a scientific basis in the sense you cannot overwhelm your immune system. So if you want them to take the COVID vaccine, let them take the COVID vaccine now. Then take the TD or Tdap. That is not a thing. Let them
Tdap is
take
not
it after.
life-saving.
Yeah, let them take that after 14 days.
Mm.
So they have to make a choice whether they like that. So, but now because the government of India has not approved, this is what I tell my patients. If they are due for TDT, let them take it now. Maybe in another 1 week or 2 weeks time, the government will approve. And by the time they register, they're registering now. Today, again, the government of Karnataka has opened for 18 to 45, that too, especially frontline workers and all that. So by the time our patients, pregnant patients become eligible for that, it may take another 2-3 weeks. By then, they might have as well finished this TD and Tdap and then wait for the vaccine, I think.
So
Or
in lactating women, like
somebody,
what
From
should we
Hyderabad.
give it immediately after the?
yes, somebody is asking this exactly the same question. COVID vaccine need to be taken once in a lifetime or like flu vaccine yearly once? Definitely, I don't think it's a once in a lifetime. It's not like rubella or something where you take it and then you are immune for life. Maybe probably they will come out with a recommendation for 6 monthly or maybe yearly, like the flu vaccine is what we are guessing right now.
And vaccine coverage is going to take some time because today, if you see the International Monetary Fund, IMF has predicted that only 35% of the population can be vaccinated till December this year.
True, true.
21 December, only 35% of Indians can be vaccinated, and still 75% will be 65% will be left out. And still, it's long way to go.
Yes, there is something. See, we started rolling out the vaccine sometime on 16th of January. Until 22nd May, only about 13 or 14% of the population have been vaccinated. Number one. Number two, whether vaccinating the community creates herd immunity is still a matter of contention. For example, if you take the measles vaccine, to attain herd immunity, 95% of the community should be vaccinated. So for attaining, first of all, we really don't know whether vaccinating the community causes herd immunity in case of COVID. And secondly, the rough estimates were maybe around 50 to 60%. But nowadays, I don't see anybody talking about herd immunity at all. Previously, they were saying during the somewhere between the first and second wave, they said 60%. If they vaccinate 60% of them, maybe there is herd immunity. And even there, people are not very sure whether there will be herd immunity or there will be no herd immunity. So as of now, the vaccines should be rolled out. More and more vaccines should come out, and we should have a basket of vaccines, especially for the pregnant women. They should be able to pay for Moderna or Pfizer and get themselves vaccinated if they are affordable, because those are the vaccines which have the best studies.
Like, what if they come and ask you now, like whatever the available vaccines, if they ask, what is the choice?
If the government has recommended, then there is no choice. They have to take, because the
Whatever is available.
the benefits of taking the vaccine is much more than the risk. So because we are in the middle of a pandemic, we are in the middle of a second wave, probably looking at the third wave. So I wouldn't tell my patient, don't take the vaccine. I would explain to her, and then and I'm sure most of the patients would go ahead. Whereas the WHO and FOXI has also warned, if a patient refuses to take a vaccine, we have to respect them. We have to tell them, and they should be informed. They should make an informed consent.
Okay.
See, as of now, as per the RCOG, they say that AstraZeneca to avoid pregnancy, but still we have no choice.
We have no choice.
We have no choice. We have to give that or Covaxin, whatever is given to us. But what is that complication, that rare case of VITT? That's all. Thrombosis risk, that we have to watch out. Yes. And find out from a good history. And if they get VITT, then they should not treat with heparin, treat with non-heparin antibodies.
What?
It does not respond to heparin.
Any of these two vaccination, do you recommend thromboprophylaxis for the patients?
No, definitely not. 11 in a million, you don't go ahead and give thromboprophylaxis for all patients.
That thromboprophylaxis is recommended for like cesarean and so many other things.
The routine one, there is no extra just because they are being given.
Extra for the vaccine.
Not at all.
Because heparin doesn't act against the VITT.
I think if there are no more questions, should we?
Question.
I think no. I finished with everything. All other. Dr. Malini was asking
vaccinate all the others.
Family members and protect pregnant women. That's what we were speaking about, herd immunity. Yes, maybe. But then if she develops it, then it is going to be severe, because pregnancy is known to increase the severity of COVID. So I would still advise her, even if the family members are vaccinated, I would still advise her to get herself vaccinated if she agrees.
I think one more question was there. When to give Tdap after
post-COVID
or whatever, post-COVID?
There's no problem.
See, no, there's no problem with Tdap or TD. Because you have to delay for about usually initially they started saying 2 months, and now they're saying 3 months, 90 days after COVID, because the antibodies are already there. But if you have to give Tdap, you can give it at any time, because you're giving the COVID vaccine after 90 days, because they already have you presume that they have the antibodies. But Tdap, I think they can be given at any time. And there is word that the government is going to extend that to 180 days or 6 months after COVID infection only. They are eligible for the vaccination. But right now, there's no recommendation. The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare says 90 days, whether they have received the monoclonal antibodies or plasma therapy or post-COVID.
They are on steroids, I think I will have to postpone for some time. If they are on steroids, which is given for COVID, for any immunization. So if there is an immunosuppression, I think so. At least
live attenuated vaccines only, madam.
Patients, all these people are receiving the vaccination.
They have to receive, because they are they are having comorbidities. They have to receive. And steroids, when it is given in COVID, it's only for short term. We are not supposed to give it for long term. And as it is post COVID, we are not vaccinating them at least for about 3 months. So, and they won't be taking steroids for that long. And especially if they are post-kidney transplantees, diabetes, hypertension, either pre-existing or developing during pregnancy, they all need to take the vaccine, whether they are pregnant or not pregnant. They're all high risk and they have to be taking the vaccine.
Okay, that was a very wonderful talk by both Shantala and Dr. Padmini. If there are no
So-
questions, I think we
I
can.
think there is
move on to
no
the-
question. I think all the questions were answered. And it was a wonderful session regarding the most awaited topic who were looking forward, each and every one of us. So that was very well addressed as of now. So I thank the speakers, Dr. Padmini ma'am and Dr. Shantala.
Thank you.
And I also thank today's chairpersons, Dr. Uma Devi and Dr. Mahesh Koregol. And I also thank all the delegates who have totally involved in the session and asked so many questions. It was in fact more interactive. And I thank Manikantan, Sun Pharma, Sonora Division. So I thank one and all for attending and make this a grand success. And I thank BSOG for giving me this opportunity to coordinate with you all. And very good evening to all of you, and stay safe.